Hello and welcome to another edition of Prove All Things. Want to thank everybody who's joining us today, whether you're watching on Facebook, YouTube, or X live, or watching in the CGI Digital Network app, whether that's on your phone, tablet, or television. We thank you for joining us. And for everyone else, either watching or listening later, thanks for joining us as well. I'm joined with co-host Mike James. How you doing, Mike?
Hey, Jeff, good to see you today. Everything's good here in California. We're getting a little bit cooler weather just starting, coming out of the mid 90s and hundreds down to the 80s for the next week or so. So that's going to be a good change here.
Yeah, that's pretty good. It was about 60 degrees this morning here where I live, and that was nice. I went to the visit the Montgomery church this past weekend in Montgomery,
Okay,
Alabama, and it was about nine. It was in the 90s. It was pretty hot visiting church, but it was a great visit we had there with the people in Montgomery, and looking forward to, I guess, being back at the home church this week in Atlanta.
good, good. Yeah, I was down there maybe a week or so before you, and it wasn't as hot as that when I was there, but it was a little muggy. And I'll be heading out to Phoenix for trumpets to speak, and then going to do some baptisms in Western Texas on my way to Tyler for the fourth Sabbath in September. I'll be there speaking.
Okay, so you'll be there before the feast. All right, sounds great. Look
Yeah,
forward to
yeah,
that. Look forward to that. All right.
yes.
Well, again, glad to have everybody joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get to our guest. I guess first time guest on the show. So we had first time last week and the first time this week, and but he's I guess well known to Mike
Yeah.
for some time. Sometime I know. So we'll get into that. We're going to welcome Tom Bettinger. How you doing, Tom?
Doing well. Thank you for having me on today.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
thanks
Yeah,
for
good,
joining us.
good to have you.
Yes, it's good to have you with us today. So, give everybody out there who's watching, I guess, maybe some background about who you are, where you're from, what church you go to, those type of things. That's usually give you, what your credentials are, I guess, to speak to
Okay.
us.
Okay. So I've been in the church officially over 30 years. Unofficially, you could probably add another 8 to 10 as I was starting to learn things from the old worldwide Church of God shows that came on. And this was when Herbert Armstrong was still alive and so forth.
Hmm.
And at that point, it was a situation where, for me, it was more of an intellectual curiosity. And it's like, okay, let's see what this is all about. It wasn't one of those instances it would convince me. To me, kind of like your show, you had to prove it that what was happening was good. Finally, got to the point after I accumulated enough knowledge, like, okay, this seems like it's true and to the point. So what are you going to do about it? So
Hmm.
for me, that's when I dove in and said, okay, this is where you actually have to practice if you're actually going to believe this is true. You had mentioned Mike was part of the local group where I'm at, which is CGI Maryland.
Hmm.
Um, and he baptized me back in around mid 90s, somewhere in there, mid to late 90s. And since then, I've carried on that tradition of looking at things from a um, not just intellectual but logical standpoint. Does the does the word that we read in the Bible make sense logically, rather than just have an emotional attachment where somebody says something? Oh yeah, this is great.
Hmm.
Well, can
Yeah.
you tell me where this is at? And they really can't answer it. And so,
Hmm.
for me, it's a matter of I want to make sure that what I'm believing, how I'm acting, what I want to teach others is directly there. I can go back to it. So that's sort of my understanding. And most lately, what I've been doing is to look at the Bibles, English Bibles that are out there, and a lot of people would ask the question about, okay, what do you think the most accurate Bible is? And from what I've read and what I've seen, there really isn't one that's completely accurate.
Hmm.
They're each one of them has something that you could say, why did they go down this route? And so for me, just to cut to the chase, and what I'm doing these days is I am going back and looking at the source text. And I know all the Bibles say they all go to the source text, but I go back with the idea of I'm not going to let any theological stance that I previously have stop
Mhm.
if I find something. And so what I found was rather amazing. First off, the languages are very difficult to understand in the way that we understand languages today.
Mhm.
That contributes to a lot of why there may be a little bit of uh, differences in the way one translation goes into
Mhm.
another, and so forth. The other thing I found is there is that theological bent that a lot of translations have put into them, and
Mhm.
you got to know where they're at and what they're saying, why they would be saying it. So
Mhm.
that's my project right now. I've been working on it for several years, a couple of false starts where, for instance, I was initially going to say, okay, let me do a better version of the New King James. Well, all I found
Mhm.
that doing was to just patch up something that really needed to be overhauled.
Mhm.
So today it really is a matter of going back to the original languages, and a lot of the things I found
Mhm.
are pretty astounding.
Right.
And it's very hard to actually get it right. You have to dig into it and to understand what they're actually doing.
So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today with you. Then it's kind of
Mhm.
some of the studying and things you've been doing, and I like your approach as far as looking at things from a very like logical proof type of way. Because I think so many
Mhm.
people, like you said, are emotional. I think most people who come to religion, they do it for emotional reasons, and they don't do it for evidence. And I think that's why so many people are just off off on the wrong path so much.
Yeah. Hey, before you do that, Tom, do you think some of your work history, being a program manager, plays into your logical approach to things? If you could just say a little bit about that.
Yeah, educationally, I'm an engineer in several fields,
Okay.
hardware, electronics, software,
Okay.
satellite, and so forth. And I ended up working for the federal government in the DC area here in some highly, um, uh, not well, secretive, but highly technical, but also very closed net type of things where you can't talk about it on the outside and so forth. But what that means is that you have to approach things from a data standpoint.
Okay.
What does the data say
Mhm.
versus what does your gut say?
Yeah.
Because you try to launch a satellite on your gut, you'll end up with a satellite in the middle of the Atlantic. Um, you have to go. You have to go with the what you know, what the data says, have contingencies, and put that together. And that's how, in a way, that's how I look at this thing. It's like, how do I approach this project of trying to make another translation, basically?
Mhm.
Uh, how do I go about it in terms of making it readable for people, make it believable for people, and just lay out the data and say, here's the data, and then from there may be some variables in there as to why translators did what they did and the translations they did. You make up your mind with all the data as to how you believe this actually should play out. And I think I told you this yesterday. What I believe, the gut for me in this whole thing is that we've made this a whole lot more difficult than it ever needed to be.
Mhm.
We've added things that's from every aspect of Christianity.
Yeah.
We just made it. They just overblown it to the point that it does confuse people because we made it harder than it ever needed to be.
Like, what give me some examples of what you mean by made it harder than it needed to be. What are some examples of that you would
Well,
say?
there are a lot of things that people will say, well, you need to do this, and you need to do that, and they'll take a scripture and they'll say, well, this is what it says fairly simplistically,
Mhm.
and do a little bit of exaggeration or conflate it into something else. And I would say things like, for instance, in our Church of God movement, where we have a big emphasis on the holy days, correctly so.
Mhm.
Um, People look, for instance, too much to, I believe, in the early part of the season where we have the Feast of Unleavening or Feast of Unleavened Bread. And
Mhm.
that's sort of another thing. It's really pointing to Feast of Unleavening, and the focus is really on the individual getting leaven from them.
Right.
And yet, a lot of times, all people talk about, well, I got to, clean out my house to the
Mhm.
micro thing, and it's like, no, that's not the point. I mean, you should clean your house,
Yeah.
But the point is, the focus is on you, and that's something, for instance,
Yeah.
the people back then wouldn't have understood, but we have the opportunity to understand a little bit better now with a little bit of hindsight.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I mean. We put too much on things, and I would submit that
Mm-hmm.
the obedience to the Father is what He's looking for. That really
Right.
boils down to that.
Yeah. You mentioned that sometimes people put their own theological beliefs in different versions of the Bible. And I think I've seen that in some, I guess in the regular King James, they have the part about the Trinity that's I think that's in where it says these three are one.
Yeah, these three agree as one Father.
One. And
First
again,
John 5.
yeah, 1 John 5, where these three agree in one, the Father, Son, Holy. But basically, the earliest text, I guess, if you look in like the Codex Sinaiticus or the Vaticanus, they don't have that in there.
No,
But the big people in the King James put that in there probably because that's what they believe. Do you think?
and there's a lot of that sort of bent. One of the things, I got it on a slide if we want to go to it.
Let's
If
go
you,
to your slides so we won't get too far off what you want to talk
okay,
about.
that'll be one of those things that
All right.
you can go to the next slide if you want, or actually the next two. I think I talk about what I've been doing, so we could go to the third slide if you like.
Okay.
So there are a lot of English translations out there, and like I said, they all seem to do things in a slightly different way, but the outcome seems to be about the same. And what I find is that when you find some obvious, what are obvious errors, they all follow the same error. So if they're all
Okay.
going back and looking at the source, why did they all make that same assumption? Some of them are just plain blatant, which I'll get to as we
Now,
go.
when you say the same error, Tom, like for the example we just gave of 1 John 5:7, definitely some of the newer versions don't have that in there.
Yeah.
When you say same error, what do you mean by that? Can you give an example?
Well, let's go ahead to the next slide. I think I've got that. So yeah, so here's an example of the same error.
Okay.
All right, so in Hebrews, you see a reference back to the Psalms, and this
Mm-hmm.
is talking about Messiah and what his purpose was and how he was established and so forth. And as we read through here in Hebrews 7, 8, and 9, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
we get a little bit of a story pointing back to an earlier prediction applying to Messiah. It says, "You have made him a little lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor and set him over the works of your hands." Now, note the word angels there. Verse 8, "You
Right.
have put all things in subjection under his feet. For in that he put in all subjection under him, he left nothing that is not put under him." But now we do not see all things put under him, but we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, and he, by the grace of Theos, might taste death for everyone. So, by the way, and the reason Teos is in there is because I'm pronouncing it the way they had it back in those original languages. Now, that's not a big deal here, but that just gives you a
Yeah.
little bit of how these languages might change just slightly. And while this is
Mm-hmm.
not a big deal, that just gives you a little bit of a sample. Today, people would say
Yeah.
Theos for what gets translated
Theos,
in
yeah.
as God. Now, what we
Right.
find here down in the Psalms, and this is where that was being referenced up there in Hebrews 2. It says, "For you have made him a little lower than the angels." Sounds good so far. "And you
Mm-hmm.
have crowned him with glory and honor. You have made him to have dominion over the work of your hands. You have put all things under his feet." Sounds very familiar.
Okay.
Okay.
Right.
Here's the problem. The word that's used, where you see in that's bolded there for angels,
Yes.
that is angelos. That is the word in the Greek, pretty familiar, or pretty much the same as it was in the Greek at the time, which is more of the common or the Koine
Right.
Greek. But the
Right.
problem is it's referencing back to the Old Testament, and you would expect that they would use. And by the way, that word angel or angelos is actually has
Yeah.
a meaning of messenger. And it could be spiritual. It also could be human. So, but
Right.
when anybody sees in our English understanding of things, whenever you see the word
Yeah.
angel, they think of spiritual. Okay.
Well, let me ask a question. Okay, but the writer of Hebrews wrote this in Greek, and the writer of Hebrews used that
hmm
word. So I think the writer of Hebrew, what did they meant by that word?
Well, they wrote it, and I'm questioning whether or not
Yeah.
the original was put in correctly because they're trying to quote directly from the Old Testament, correct?
I mean, yeah, I guess the person who wrote Hebrews was quoting from the
Okay.
Psalms. Yes.
So here's the problem. Going back
Yeah.
to the Psalms chapter 8, verse 5, it says, it gets translated,
Right.
you made him a little lower than the angels. If that was
hmm
true, if that word was supposed to be angels or messenger, it would have been malachim. Okay.
Right.
It's not malachim, it's Elohim.
Elohim.
So you have to ask,
So question, uh, when we see, so there are words that have multiple definitions.
hmm
So, we could possibly say, again, I'm just putting a possibility there
mhm.
that, hey, this is just another word, possible word for angel, using a different, word, just like, we could use a different word for this, that, or the other thing.
You might, if they use that word to point to anything but the, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, they have words that would equate to either Teos in the New Testament or Elohim in the Old Testament. And it primarily points to the Father, the Heavenly Father. It could also point to the
Yeah.
family, which is the Father and the Son at this time. Don't think,
Yeah.
hmm
I don't think you'll ever find that word used to talking about a human messenger as a messenger. They would talk about it in terms of
hmm
you would be part of that family. Like, for instance, the Old Testament is referenced in the New Testament directly by Messiah saying, is it not written that you will also be Teos as written? Or in the Old Testament, Hebrew, it would have been Elohim, but we would, in the way that we write down things, it would be
Right.
small e in that case, not talking about the Father or the Son.
Right. So just taking what we have in Psalms, where it says you made him a little lower than the angels, and you said the original word in Hebrew is
hmm
Elohim. Now the writer of Hebrews may have just had the Septuagint to refer to. Have you looked into the Septuagint to see how the Septuagint translated to
Okay.
Hebrew in that particular
And this
case?
is I have not, but this is the
Okay.
problem of translations. No two
Right.
languages, no matter if they're old, new, or whatever, no two
Yeah.
languages have a one-to-one correspondence. And so what happens
Yep.
is every time you translate, whether it's Koine Greek into English or whatever, there
hmm
is or there's likely to be, and usually always is, a loss of fidelity somewhere. You
hmm
lose the meaning in a lot of these things. So, for
Yeah.
instance, we have messenger as being a generic term in this case. It could be in both the old Greek, the old Hebrew. It could mean an English, or excuse me, it could mean a human messenger. It also could mean a spiritual messenger. And this is
hmm
where context plays a big role that we're not used to in the English language. We have very specific words that they didn't have back then. They would have a single word or maybe two words that could be used in a myriad of ways. And the problem is you
Yeah.
got to know the kind. What, Mike James? What's the thing about context?
That it really matters a lot when
Context
you're
is,
looking
as
at
you
the
say, context
languages
is
in the
king.
Yeah.
Bible. Yeah.
Context is king.
Right.
Now, back then, I believe the people understood context a lot more than we do because they had much less of a lexicon of words that they could use. There are words that, for instance, the word Natan, which is where we get the name Nathan from. It has a base
Yeah.
meaning, and is a Hebrew word. It means to give, or a giver. In the Old Testament, that word gets translated over 4 dozen different ways. And it really
Right.
is context as to how that should be applied. Now, getting back to what we're seeing here, they
Mhm.
have a word they have a word that which could have translated directly back between the
Yeah.
Greek and this. And then becomes the question is, why would somebody change this? And it may be
Mhm.
that that they put that into the Septuagint as such, as being
Mhm.
um, the word agalos versus malachim. And the question
Yeah.
is, why would they do that? They
Mhm.
either are unfamiliar with it, or they may have changed it intentionally. I would ask the question, did they change it intentionally? And the reason why I say, and this sort of goes back to what we were saying, did people do things
Yeah.
to try to perhaps press a theology that might not be there? You had mentioned back in First John where we had the situation where somebody blatantly inserted something that says the three
Yeah.
agree, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and so forth.
Yeah. Another example is in the NIV, where it says Jesus declared all
Yeah,
meats clean. You know what I'm talking about? Like, that's obviously somebody put that in there because that doesn't even go with the underlying Greek anywhere.
And doesn't the fact that I think in some translations there's kind of parens around that statement, will those be some tip-offs, Tom, in certain translations where you see words that are italicized, or sometimes things are in parens, that we know that that's a little hint or an indicator?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they do. The ones that come up with later translations or revise their earlier translations will go back in and put parentheses, or they'll put it in the notes, with a little marker that says, okay, in the
Right.
footnotes, things like that.
Yeah.
Speaking of italics, have you ever noticed that the only versions that I've seen that ever actually use italicized words is the King James and the New King James? All the other ones,
Yeah. Those words are words that are like additionally
those are
added.
words that were added
Right.
by the translators to try to make the understanding easier. The
Yeah, I
problem,
think
Yeah.
that's an important point to make, because people really jump on that a lot, and they say, "Oh, that's not in the original." But in doing a little bit of study, what I found is that what they're doing, like what you were saying earlier, Tom, they're trying to get it to be understood in the English in a better way. Yeah, you could argue and debate, okay, well, that wasn't an original Greek word, but sometimes it's correct because that's the only way to understand it in it. You get what I'm saying here?
yeah, they'll put the
Mhm.
name of somebody into a sentence of a paragraph to keep the flow of the logic. It's like, who is now saying this? And they'll
Yeah.
say, somebody's name, and it'll be in italics. And like I said, the only place I really see these italics are in those King James or New King James. They don't do it in
Right.
the other, NIV, RSV, all these things. The problem there
Right.
is, and I'll give you the example. If you were to look at Mark 16, verse 9, in that first line, it says, now on the first day of the week, when, and depending on which one you're looking at, it will say Jesus in italics, or it'll say he in
Yeah.
italics. Well, in either case, neither one of those words are in the original Greek. And the problem is, people could look to that and say, well, see, here's your proof that he rose on the first day of the week.
Yeah. Well, there's some. Well, Mark, isn't Mark 16:9? Isn't that those that's not even found like in the earliest versions that we have when we have the earliest versions
Mhm.
of Mark.
Well, I'm just
I
saying
mean, we
what's
have
available today.
you
These
go
people
if
are,
you go to like the again, the Codex Sinaiticus doesn't have that part of Mark in there, and so you'll see in the notes saying earliest versions that we have don't have these verses, about handling snakes and those type of things that are in there.
Those are the translations I believe you're finding in things like NIV, RSV, ASV, and so forth, which
Yeah.
are separate from King James and New King James, which uses what's it called, Septus Receptus.
Textus Receptus.
Textus Receptus. And it's a different set. So that's why you will actually find between those two groupings, you'll find a lot of things, especially from the newer ones that came after New King James. They will not have those verses in there. So if you're reading beside with somebody else, all of a sudden they don't see anything. Whereas in those those other ones, the King James, they will. So and that's primarily a New Testament issue of things in this Bible, not in this Bible.
Yeah, I've seen where some Bibles actually in the comments, if you get one with the comments, it'll talk about that and at least tell you that, okay, we're keeping this out, but da-da-da-da. But let me ask you this, Tom, since we get some comments coming in, one good example of what you're talking about right now is William Blank is mentioning Revelation 22:14, which in the NIV, I believe, says, blessed are those who wash their robes that they may have the right to the tree of life. Where in the King James, it says, blessed are those who keep his commandments. Okay. And so that's where there are some examples here where it's a big deal in some of these.
Yeah, it's a big
not
difference.
all of them, but some of them, it's like, whoa, that's pretty different, right?
Yeah.
And you're gonna find, like I said, especially in the New Testament, a lot of those type of discrepancies, especially going back to the original material. And the question is, how do you handle that? I mean, there are some things that we could look at, especially, well, not New Testament so much, but Old Testament, where we have the Apocrypha, where there's just a lot of books out there that people were trying to pawn off as being scripturally inspired and so forth. And they're fairly easy to see that they just don't fit. There's some sort of error that they introduce. That's why, for instance, you don't have the Maccabees in there. But it's great. It's great historical evidence. But it just has a little bit in there that says, okay, this doesn't look quite there. So, you have to, me personally, I think what we basically have in the canon of books that we're showing right now, I think we have the ones that we need, or the ones that were meant to come forward. There are literally hundreds of others that people try to put out there and so forth. And it's usually a matter of, if we have this set that we have now and look to other things like, what about what the Seventh-day Adventists propose? What about the books like the Book of Mormon? How does that fit in there? Well, it doesn't, because it flies out fairly quickly going against things. So.
Tom, quick,
gotcha.
I'm sorry, Jeff.
Go ahead,
Quick question we got from Life Lessons in the chat box there. They want your opinion on study aids. For example, they're mentioning the Strong's Concordance and various commentaries that are out there. Do you have any feedback on that, Tom?
Yeah, Strong does an okay job. He's not entirely correct on some things. Like, for instance, the word that we have for Gad in the
have for what?
Gad, G-A-D.
Okay.
Some translations bring it forth and they'll point it to fortune, which I believe is correct. They'll also say something like a troop comes. So he's saying it could either mean fortune or it could mean troop. And I think he missed it on the troop part. I think that's not the case. I think it's another word which is close, but not the same one. So he, like everyone else of us, when we go through these things, we find things and then we find out maybe we had a little bit of error. We try to make course corrections. As far as a lot of the commentaries that are out there today, they often point to a more of a traditional Christianity, Sunday keeping viewpoint, and so you got to watch out what they say. I would say a good source to look at, which doesn't get, I don't think, get a lot of play, is to look at Wilhelm Cassinius. Have you ever heard the name?
What is that now?
Wilhelm Cassinius. He was,
and who was he, Tom? I've heard that name, Cassinius. I forget.
Yeah, he was a 19th century German linguist, and I don't think he was in religion, but he wasn't like a priest or anything like that. I think he was just a language person, and he did a lot of studies on things, and I think he gives a better understanding, especially the way the words come out, how they're being used in the Old Testament. They play a little bit better even than Strong's. And I'm not saying throw out Strong's or anything like that. The whole gamut of these things work out pretty well, but I think Cassinius does a better job with the Old Testament. I don't think he did anything as far as the New Testament was concerned.
So he was an early guy who created a concordance of some sort.
It's not he published books, but they weren't really concordances.
Okay.
He just gave an idea of you can find his writings, and they are at least from the standpoint of word definitions there for people to be able to explore.
One thing about translations, I guess, that's kind of coming to my mind is that when we're translating from the original, there's certain things we'll never really know that we try to do our best, but like, for instance, like in English, there are certain words like light, the word light. Light could mean like that comes from the sun, or it could mean light, something that doesn't weigh very much, or light, I'm gonna catch something on fire. The one word we have in English means so many different things. Or we have things like idioms, right? You have like idiom, like say for instance, break the ice. Like, we're going to break the ice. If you saw that in a book 2,000 years from now, are you thinking people are just sitting around breaking ice? We're going to sit around and break the ice, or are we actually, or like hit the sack? So I'm going to go hit the sack tonight. That means go to bed, right? But somebody 2,000 years from now, they read, hey, he went and hit the sack. Like, is he like out? Is he punching a punching bag? What is he doing? So I think there's certain things like idioms and language we'll never really know because we're so far removed from that time. Don't you think?
Perhaps, but what we should be able to do is, if we're trying to find something very specific for the biblical presentation, is to try to find every place that we could find with a similar idea to see if that means, or if there's additional data. This gets back to the data thing. Can we find something that will help us to understand whether this is true or not, or if it was written down there correctly? And but like, for instance, and I sort of mentioned it to you yesterday, we were prepping for this thing, the idea of, in the book of Revelation, it talks about Satan, and it talks about what will happen with Satan. It says Satan will be tormented forever. Okay, so the question becomes, and the Greek is just like the Hebrew in that they have a limited lexicon with many applications and the way they use things that aren't as precise as we have in the English. So when somebody says torment, what do most people think? They think that the person is in agony or something like that, where they can't do anything about it. The word that's used there, and I'm trying to think of what exactly what the word actually is used several different ways in that New Testament text. A better word that could be in there, and I'll get to the part about what I think it means, is more of a thwarting, meaning you've stopped something, or you've vexed, meaning you've stopped something that is occurring that somebody wanted to occur, and so forth. And the other thing, and this is true for both the Old Hebrew and the New the Old Hebrew and the Old Greek, is that the word that we translate forever, well, I'll just say it. We have a word forever, which even in our minds, we have trouble when you dig down deep to try to get
Right.
its meaning. Doesn't
Yeah.
really help. In both of those old languages, and probably in both of the new languages, new versions of those languages, there is no such word as forever by itself. I mean, an exclusive word that says forever.
Well, there's parts in the Bible that says certain things are going to last forever, and those things obviously didn't last forever.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
So
definitely.
in the old
Tom, you're
Old
correct, and that's a big point when you get into that conversation about eternal punishment and things like that. Yeah,
Yeah, and,
Yeah.
and so you look to, getting back to the Revelation thing. All right, did they mean forever, or did they mean something else? Did they mean at the
Mhm.
end of some period of time, whether it's long or fairly short or
Right.
whatever? And that's where you need to look to other places to say, does this make sense? And
Mhm.
it goes back to, I'll go ahead and bring it up. I don't know if I put it in there or not, but the idea of a soul versus a spirit. Now, most
Mhm.
people think of they're one and the same, and yet in
Right.
both the Old and the New Testament, the languages that are used here, they have different words for those things. So for spirit, it's ruach in the Old Hebrew, and it's pneuma in the Greek. And so, all right, so we have those, and you've heard the expression people will use immortal spirit or immortal soul. And so, what about this soul thing? Where do we see that? So, if we look back to where that word is actually used, the word
Mhm.
in the Hebrew is nefesh. All right, and that gets used in various ways. Gets translated, like I said, single word, many ways it gets presented. It
Yeah.
could mean soul or life or
body.
being
Creature.
or things like that. Uh,
Yeah, because animals are referred to nefesh
mhm.
in the Old Testament, right? So like creatures or
And
something.
so the question then becomes, with the way that those things are using, is that equivalent to a spirit? Is it equivalent to
Yeah.
a ruach? Because ruach back there
Mhm.
gets used for spirit or breath or wind, just like it does the
Mhm.
equivalent pneuma in the New Testament. Um,
Yeah. I was just reading. I guess it's in Ecclesiastes. The spirit returns to the God who
mhm.
gave it. Uh, I was reading the other day. And I started thinking about that. So thinking about what that word actually means. We sometimes thought, oh, this is the spirit goes back to God, and God has the spirit, or it's just saying that God, the breath of life, returns back to
Yeah,
God. It could be just as simple as that when you look at those
yeah.
type of
Those are two
words.
ways
There's
people look at that, and yeah,
yeah,
that makes a big
maybe,
difference, one or the other.
yeah, based on that one word you're talking about.
Yeah, and so they they have those words, and talking about the people who believe in the immortal soul and things like that. And the equivalent word in the New Testament is pasuke. And I'm butchering the Greek, Mike. So apologize to your
Yeah,
mother for me. Uh,
yeah.
Psuke. It uses that upsilon, which is kind of hard to pronounce if you're not used to it, and so forth. But in the Hebrew version, nefesh and psuke for the Greek, they have the same meaning. They have a base meaning of the unseen. Now, how they get applied is usually people mean grave or sepulcher or
Mhm.
something like that. But they do have the same base meaning, and then they apply it in a number of ways in that general area and so forth. So the question
Mhm.
is, do people have an immortal soul?
Right.
And I brought this up with you yesterday. All right, what can we
Mhm.
find out about this quote unquote soul that's in the New or
Yes.
the Old Testament or so forth? And you'll find
Mhm.
that word gets used in a way that most people don't think about. And that is,
Mhm.
in human beings, we all have a nefesh. We have a soul.
Right.
Animals, like you say, have a nefesh. Okay. Do they have a spirit within them? All right, unless that is, if it is a spirit, then that's starting to ask some questions. But can, for instance, spirit beings have a nefesh? And the answer is yes,
Right.
because you'll find that that same word is applied to our Heavenly Father. And he says things like, my soul abhors you, my nefesh abhors you.
Right.
So are we
Yeah.
talking about a spirit within a spirit, or are we talking about something else?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one thing about, just to
Yeah.
give people a hint here, that psuche in the Greek is transliterated, although it's really translated too. You know the difference between translation and transliteration? Okay.
Yeah, but go ahead, Tom.
Okay.
Why don't you just
Yeah.
tell the
So
folks
the
out there?
word, the word that gets translated is one that's very familiar to people in psychoanalysis of human beings in particular.
Right.
And that word that gets
Right.
translated is psyche.
Psyche.
And
Yeah.
so what would this soul be? Better translation or better understanding would be the characteristics that make whatever that living being is. You know, what they believe, how they act, what they do, and so forth. And that could be
Yeah.
your dog, that could be a human, that could be our Heavenly Father. You know, what does he think, how does he
Yeah.
act, and so forth.
Character, maybe.
Character.
Yeah. Yeah. Or like a person or a being. I know in Ezekiel it says the soul that sins
Yeah.
shall die. Right. So I think Ezekiel 18 something there. So the soul that sins shall die. I think that's nefesh. If I believe correctly, the soul that sins shall die. So, the word nefesh probably has those multiple meanings, like you're saying. That when we can't just look at it as this one thing.
Yeah.
But
Context. Yeah.
context is king.
Context is very
But
important.
what the other part of what you said, and that phrase occurs twice in Ezekiel 18 there.
Yeah.
The part that people can't seem to get through is the word die. Death means death. It's the opposite of life. It's not it's not translating or transforming between one state of being of existence of like human to then a spiritual existence as a being. You know, death means death. You know, and you know there are many places, New and Old Testament, where it says that the dead are basically dead. They don't know anything. They can't do anything. They can't. You know, there's nothing they can do. And yet people.
And isn't that what we observe? That's how we observe the dead, right? The dead we see, they don't know anything. They're in the grave. We have no observations of any dead living on past their life, right?
So, and there are some who will say, well, you know, I was dead and then I saw a bright light and I came back and all that stuff. Well, I forgot what the term for that is, but if somebody really
near death experience.
Yeah. So if you really want to see a bright light, go run up to that door and put your head into the door jamb. You'll see a white light.
But here's the thing with near-death experiences. Most people who almost died but come back don't have them. It's a very small percentage of people who almost die who have something, and then brain chemistry. There's a lot of stuff going on about what that could be, but that's another show. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So one of the things about I don't know if you want me to continue through here a little bit, but one of the things I found out with
You have another slide we want to go to, or just continue discussion?
Go ahead to the next slide.
Okay.
Trying to think of where we're at here. Slide 6, I guess it is.
All right, 6.
Okay. So go back one. Okay. So names have meaning. That's the one thing that we don't pick up at all from looking at both the Old Greek and the Old Hebrew. And I'll give us a little thing here. Like for instance, you two, both of you, your first, middle, and last names have a meaning. And if I could, for Mike, for instance, let me find my notes here on this. But Michael, all right, verse, go down here to 6. So I'll give you mine first. My full name is
Okay.
Richard Thomas Bettinger. All right.
Mm-hmm.
What does Richard mean? Richard comes from the Middle English, and it means something like brave ruler or strong leader or something like that. Thomas is one that, if you're biblically literate, you probably already know what the meaning of that is. It comes from the Greek Thomas, and it's actually transliterated from the Hebrew Teomen, and that means twin or double. The interesting one is the last name, Bettinger, and it's an anglicized German word, which actually comes from the German as Botiger. And what that name means is bottle maker. So what I'm getting at here is that words all have meanings, whether you realize it or not.
Hey, you have a word right here, theophory. Could you give a definition of that word, theophory?
I'd have to look it up. I know Theo
Okay.
is talking about.
You have it right here in the
about,
notes. Yeah.
Theo God.
Oh, Theodore, you're talking about, right?
The word you
Oh
have here in
yeah,
the notes, it
Theodore.
says
So
theophory.
outside of
What does that mean?
what that means is, let me go down there. It basically means Theo, which means from Theos or God from
Right.
the Greek. And
Mm-hmm.
try to find my notes here for that particular one. Did I have
Okay.
this before or afterward here? What did I do?
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to remember what the second part means.
Gotcha.
So my apologies.
No, that's okay.
It's all right.
But
Jeff, you
anyway,
got your
I'll
phone
find
handy?
it eventually and get it back to you.
Yeah.
Mike James, Michael Harry James. So what does Michael mean? And that is from the Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
It is Michael, which
Mikhail.
means who is like El or Elohim, the shortened version of Elohim. Harry comes from the Middle English. It's a form of Henry, and it means ruler or army ruler, something like that. And this is the one I find really interesting. James. Where do we get James from? It's a form of Jacob. And I'll talk if I have time. I'll go back to that. What that means.
Mm-hmm.
But that's actually one that has a meaning that you can get from the text around when it's first introduced back in Genesis, talking about Jacob when he was born and what he had done. Your name, Jeffrey David Reed, correct?
Yeah. Yep. Jeffrey David
Here's
Reed.
an interesting one. Jeffrey comes from the Old German name Gottfried. And that's similar to the Old English. By the way, Old German and Old English basically came from the same language tree, same branching system.
Yeah.
But Joffrey,
Right.
Old English Joffrey, has the elements Gott or God and Fried, which means peace. So it basically means God of peace.
Oh.
Okay. Now, David, which is familiar to everybody, it has a meaning. It's a Hebrew word, originating word, and it basically means loving. Reed is of Old English origin, and it means red or red hair, deriving from somebody who has either a red complexion, ruddy complexion, or red hair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my grandfather had red hair.
So, again, the point is that everybody's name has a meaning. And getting back to what you were talking about here, that example of Theodore is an example of theophory, which is where you incorporate the name of a deity into the name that you're creating. And Theodore, Theos, and Dore, which means gift. So it's basically Theos's gift. And if you look back to, say, for the Bible, if you look back to the Hebrew, you could look to something like Jonathan. Getting back to this Natan thing I was telling you about. For the Hebrew, Yonatan or Yehonatan. And it basically means Yahweh has given, or Yahweh is the giver. So all
Mhm.
these names have meanings behind what they did. And you could look to the reason I say this is because when you read the text and understand what the names of the words mean, you can see how they perfectly fit into place into what the context was saying. Words are, I don't know if they were invented at that time, but they're certainly introduced at the time something significant happened.
So Tom, the significance, I give you one example. Tell me if this is correct. So let's say, Jacob's wrestling with God. We believe, okay, or some people say, well, that's what was going on. And then you see the name of that place that was given there after that encounter, and it
Mhm.
says that the place was named, something like, God, whatever it was named. But the hint was, well, this probably was God or manifestation of Jesus
Mhm.
in his pre-existent state, who was wrestling with him, because the name became for that place this, right?
Mhm.
That
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Yeah, and like I said, you'll find that throughout. You'll find out throughout both the Old and the New Testament for these things, and starting at the very beginning with Adam and going to Eve and so forth, and the children that they had and the children that they had and so forth, you can see
Mhm.
the circumstances where their names were given to reflect what was going on. Adam, the name Adam itself means ruddy, and it's just a reflection back of a slightly reddish but a human being. And that gets translated not just for the individual name Adam, but to a lot of times it's translated into things like a man or men. And they do the same thing in the New Testament. The way they're
Right.
pronouncing it is slightly different. And that's another thing which we probably won't be able to get to today. There are,
Mhm.
while there's a limited lexicon, there's a fairly complex way that they structure a lot of their sentences, but also how they change their words, their blocks of letters to indicate
Mhm.
certain things that we normally in English would just have as a separate word, like, of, or, something like Mike's, Mike apostrophe S would be of Mike.
Yeah.
And in the language, they would modify the single word a little bit to reflect that,
To make it a
to make it a
possessive.
possessive, like
Okay.
teos in the Greek. If it's of teos, it would just be teo. You take off the S at the end.
Okay.
Things like
Gotcha.
that. Eve, her name was actually Hava, which means life giver. In the New Testament, it's Ewa, which means life. It's very similar. But you'll find that, by the way, most of the words that we translate into English tend to transliterate those things from the Greek rather than the Hebrew. Um, Avram, father of the high,
Yeah.
my father,
Right.
versus Avraham, which means father of the multitude. His
Yeah.
wife his wife has similar things. When she changed from
Yeah.
one to the other, went from noble princess to noble woman.
Right.
So,
Hey, Tom, there's a
Mhm.
question
sure.
here from Life Lessons. After understanding the context, how do you clarify the meaning of words? I think I got an answer to that, but if you could help this person understand, when we say you got to look at the context, how that can then explain to you, oh, this word must mean this instead of that.
Mhm.
Well, except for maybe Natan, which I had mentioned earlier, a lot of these things have a similar idea of which way they're going. Like there are sometimes you have words that they almost seem to have polar opposites of what they're trying to say. Like there's a
Mhm.
specific word which I can't get off the top of my head, but it's basically a person who is dealing with the exchange of cattle. So in the
Okay.
context, is this person selling the cattle or are they buying the cattle? Now we have the word that says they're buying it or they're selling it. For them back
Yeah.
there, they just say this word.
Okay.
They go,
Okay,
if that
gotcha.
helps. So
Yeah.
that's one way. That's actually a fairly easy way of doing it. Even on our English, even if we have one word that we think is fairly specific to a situation, we can usually substitute it in something fairly similar that fits in
Mm-hmm.
there, and they do that sort of thing. But there are, getting back to the revelation thing, there is no such thing as a word forever by itself. And
Mm-hmm.
how do you do that? Well, that's when you start going back and saying, and we started down that road and then sort of stopped. But it is a matter
Mm-hmm.
of understanding, can we find other places where this scripture would be more clear cut with the word that they're using? And the other one, as an example, I think I mentioned this to you yesterday, the word that gets used for the word week, WEEK, as an example. Like,
Right.
is there
Right.
such a word for the equivalent?
Like you're saying Sabaton? Is that the
No.
word you're referring
Well,
to?
I'll get to that, but
Or
that's at
okay.
there. But the word that gets translated for 7, the ordinal 7, also gets used for the word week,
Yeah.
as in the 7th day of a 7-day period. It
Yeah.
also gets used, and so they don't use the word week. They say at the end of my 7, like in Jacob was to fulfill his week. Well, he fulfilled his 7, is what it, if you get down to the base meaning of those things. That word also gets used to, and in several other ways too, but it also gets used to establish that you're providing an assurance or an affirmation at a high level. And so an oath uses that same word to say, basically I'm sevening this situation, or by confidence that I'm making sure this will happen. My oath says this will happen. I'm giving you my oath. Well, I'm sevening it by repeating it 7 times. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. And so that word obviously would mean the end of a 7-day period, and it might in some cases indicate a 7. So to answer the person's question, you have to look at the context, and that's one thing we don't have in this language of English, which they apparently understood a whole lot more than we do. They understood the context of things, whereas it's fairly easy for us because we can be very specific with the word that we choose,
Mm-hmm.
and it can be very very specific. They could, what was what I talked to you about, like baking a cake. They have the same word that would be applied
Mm-hmm.
to putting together the mix, putting it in the oven, pulling it out of the oven, putting the icing on it. They have the same
Mm-hmm.
word, but in context, we understand by the word of mixing, baking, icing. We could be very specific on what we're trying to do
Mm-hmm.
where they don't. And so
Okay.
All right.
bottom line to this whole thing, it's very hard to do this. And it really does mean that you have to be able to go everywhere that you can to see if what they're saying here has some validity or a way of confirming it somewhere else to get to understand the context. Did they use the right
Yeah.
word? And sometimes they don't. Maybe on purpose, maybe not on purpose. But I found too many places where there is a theological bent. That was one of the first things I understood going through these things.
Mm-hmm.
You got to watch out for what they're saying. Even the concordances do that. They have somebody signing their paycheck when they're doing this stuff, so they don't want to rock
Mm-hmm.
the boat too much. Even the Hebrew writers in the Old Testament, the one thing you'll find in the Old Hebrew is that they don't muck around with the consonant letter blocks.
Mm-hmm.
They may say that it gets the vowels that you would use would be this, which would make the word meaning change, but they knew enough not to mess around with the original. And that's why
Mm-hmm.
taking that and going to a Septuagint which, by the way, I don't buy its validity one bit. I mean, I know it's there. I think the story behind it and the fact that you're going from one language to another to now another language, and like I said, the fidelity of what the original was trying to say usually gets lost every time you make those jumps.
Gotcha. We're starting to wind down, Tom. We can bring you back in the future, but you want to encapsulate what you wanted to get across today? Closing comments here?
Yeah. Before that, I have a question though. So we have all these translations, we have all these different meanings of words, but would you agree or disagree that generally by reading the Bible we can get the message of God's word? God wants to get to us through the Bible. If the message He wants us to have, we can get that message regardless of these.
I believe you can. I just think there are a few places which might trip a few people up, which will lead them to those tangents. It says here that basically he rose on a Sunday on the first day of the week. Therefore, that's why we're supposed to keep Sunday or something like that. So those aside, what we have is very, if nothing else, a good starting point. And you could say that reading through those and putting aside whatever theological understanding you might have had before, so that if you do come across something that pushes against that, investigate and look a little bit further. What I'm trying to do is get it to the point of saying, okay, as much as we can, here's what the originals were saying, here's how it was used. You make your decision on what would be there. And part of my plan here in this whole thing is also to come up with a commentary. But with that commentary, what I'm saying in a lot of cases is this could mean this. Do your own investigation. I'm not saying you have to believe this or do this or whatever, but I think there's more there. The other part of that is what I was talking about, and I can talk about it more later if you like. The fact that these words have meanings and they flow and so into the story tremendously well. There are things, and if I got it just 30 seconds, the word Armageddon in the New Testament, from two Hebrew words, mountain of Megiddo. And the story behind that's when the 200 million man army gets together and they're going to come into Jerusalem. What does the word Megiddo mean? It means rendezvous. And so these type of things play right into the storyline, and it makes it much more believable. And like I said, I've read things like the Quran and the Book of Mormon and all these other things, and they don't even come close. You can usually find fairly quick, just like with the Apocrypha, you could look fairly quickly and find the flaws. And but if you look at this stuff true, try to go back to the original if you can understand the original and play these in. Again, for me, it's a logical thing. Logically, it makes sense. The data flows. The data makes sense. So, and I'm not discarding the emotional aspect of it, but whatever you do in life, if all you live by is your emotions, you're going to fail. Things just don't work out. So maybe I take it too much to the data angle and so forth, but I'm an engineer by mentality, and so that works for me.
At least you know what to watch for yourself.
Yeah. All right. I just want to bring up one comment from Gary Kellum, who says, "The longtime advice of the church, let the Bible interpret itself."
Good statement.
So that's it's good. Yeah, you don't just look at one specific thing and say that's it. You have to look at the whole context, the whole Bible, to get an idea. Like for example, where Jesus in the new NIV says, "Therefore Jesus declared all meats clean." You have to compare that to everything else in the Bible and say, does that make sense with what we read here and what's going on here? And the fact, if it doesn't make sense, you have to say why.
If you're well versed throughout the Bible, you will find that there is an explanation for all of those things. It's just like when people will look to, well, over here it says that there were 700 that died, and over here it says it was 50,700 that died. Well, you look at
Yeah.
that a little bit, or the cost of when David purchased the threshing floor. Well, it said here it cost him this, but over here it says a whole lot more. Well, it's talking about two different things. It's talking about what was the cost of the floor versus what was the cost of the whole place. You know, you have to look at what is it actually saying. So that's why I say,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
really
and
have to
some of those numbers, you'll note that the Hebrew is very close on a cup. Maybe a copyist made one little mistake in that manuscript series. You know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there you could yeah, there are things that come up with these also in terms of, like in Zechariah, was it Zechariah 3 or 4, where it talks about he saw this fire in the lid, and he said put the lid on there, or he said inside there was a woman and it was evil, and put the lid back on there. Well, the word they translate as woman, which is Isha. And if you think about that in the context, the word Esha, or fire, makes more sense. And so you look at that, and that's just a difference in the code and the marking, you know, the vowel markings, which aren't in the original because all of their writings were strictly in the consonants, and it was a learned experience as to what vowel should be in there and how those things are supposed to be pronounced. Like I said, it's harder than you think, but it's there. It's just a lot of work to try to get it deciphered through.
Well, thanks, Tom.
Right.
Appreciate this. I know we just scratched the surface. If you're up for it, we'll try to get you back to continue the conversation.
Sure.
Yeah, we only made it through a couple of slides, so I think we definitely have more we can discuss about this. So again, thank you for joining us today. I want to thank everyone out there for your comments and discussion that you're having there on Facebook, YouTube, or X, or whatever your comments are coming from. We appreciate that. Appreciate you, Tom, again for being here, and we'll see everybody again next week on another edition of Prove All Things. Goodbye.
Thanks
for now.
all.
Thank you.